March 6, 1944. Dawn breaks cold over a Luftwaffe fighter base near Brunswick, Germany. Ground crews wheel Messerschmitt Bf-109s from their hardened shelters, frost clinging to the camouflage paint. Pilots gather in the briefing hut, smoking cigarettes, confident. They have flown these skies for years. They know the rhythm of the American raids. The heavy bombers will come, lumbering formations of B-17s and B-24s, and the German fighters will rise to meet them. The Americans will turn back when their short-range escorts run out of fuel. It has always been this way. Berlin remains untouchable by day. The Reich's heartland stays safe. But today the rhythm breaks. Today, a silver fighter with a bubble canopy and laminar flow wings will appear where no single-engine American fighter has ever flown. And when the Luftwaffe pilots see it circling above the Brandenburg Gate, everything they know about this war will shatter. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany in 1943 faced a brutal mathematics problem. American doctrine demanded daylight precision bombing, hitting factories, rail yards, oil refineries with accuracy impossible at night. British Bomber Command flew by darkness, area bombing cities, accepting civilian casualties as the price of survival. The Americans insisted they could do better. They built the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, heavy bombers bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, designed to defend themselves in massed formations. The theory looked perfect on paper. The reality became a bloodbath. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, revealed the crisis. 376 bombers struck ball-bearing factories deep in Germany. 60 never returned. German fighters swarmed the formations beyond the range of P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, attacking with cannon and rocket. The Americans shot down many attackers, but the Luftwaffe could afford losses better than the 8th Air Force could. Worse came on October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. A second Schweinfurt raid sent 291 bombers. 60 were shot down. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. 600 men gone in a single afternoon. The loss rate exceeded sustainability. At this rate, no bomber crew could complete the required 25 missions. The average life expectancy of an 8th Air Force crewman dropped to 11 missions. General Ira Eaker suspended deep penetration raids. Without fighter escort to Germany's interior, the bombers could not survive. The P-47 Thunderbolt, magnificent at high altitude, could only reach 175 miles into enemy territory before fuel forced a turn home. The P-38 Lightning had range but struggled in the cold European skies, engines failing, pilots freezing. German cities beyond this invisible line, Berlin, Leipzig, Munich, remained sanctuaries. Factories operated in daylight. Training bases prepared new pilots unmolested. The Luftwaffe controlled the Deep Reich and they knew it. The P-51 Mustang's origin story began not with American vision but with British desperation. In April 1940, the Royal Air Force Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an urgent request. Britain needed fighters immediately. North American had never built a fighter aircraft. They manufactured trainers. The British wanted them to build P-40 Warhawks under license. James Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president, made a bold counteroffer. His team could design a superior fighter from scratch in the same time frame. The British were skeptical but desperate enough to agree. The contract specified 102 days from approval to prototype. North American's chief engineer Edgar Schmud worked with impossible intensity. He studied every fighter design available, German, British, American. He incorporated the NACA laminar flow wing, reducing drag dramatically. He positioned the radiator beneath the fuselage with a duct designed to generate thrust from waste heat. The cockpit sat far back, giving the pilot unmatched visibility. On October 26, 1940, exactly 102 days after approval, the prototype rolled out. Test pilot Vance Breeze flew it on October 26, 1940. It was fast, stable, beautiful. But it had a fatal flaw. The Allison V1710 engine powering the early Mustang performed brilliantly at low altitude but gasped above 15,000 feet. It lacked a two-stage supercharger. At the altitudes where bombers flew and German fighters intercepted, 25,000 feet and higher, the P-51A became mediocre. The RAF assigned Mustangs to Army Cooperation Command for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. The Americans used them similarly. A magnificent airframe wasted on secondary roles. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang at the RAF's Duxford base in April 1942. He immediately recognized the airframe's potential. He wrote a report to Rolls-Royce recommending they mate the Mustang with their Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire legendary. Rolls-Royce agreed. They pulled a Mustang airframe and installed a Merlin 61 with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. The modified aircraft, designated Mustang X, first flew at Hucknall on October 13, 1942. The transformation was staggering. Top speed jumped from 390 miles per hour to 437 miles per hour. Service ceiling rose from 31,000 feet to over 41,000 feet. The Merlin-powered Mustang could outperform the Spitfire 9 at high altitude. More importantly, its range exceeded any fighter in existence. With external drop tanks, a simple innovation allowing fighters to carry disposable fuel tanks that could be jettisoned before combat, the P-51 could fly over 2,000 miles. It could escort bombers to Berlin and back. The missing piece of the strategic bombing puzzle had been found. Packard Motor Company began producing Merlin engines under license in the United States. North American redesigned the Mustang around the Packard V1650-3. The P-51B emerged in late 1943, followed by the definitive P-51D with a bubble canopy and 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. Each gun carried 400 rounds. Combined rate of fire reached 4,200 rounds per minute. The ammunition load gave sustained combat capability. The gun sight, the K-14 computing sight in later models, calculated deflection automatically. A pilot only needed to frame the target and pull the trigger. German fighter pilots in early 1944 remained among the most experienced aviators in the world. Many had flown since the Spanish Civil War. They had conquered Poland, France, the Balkans. They had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. They flew aircraft they understood intimately. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, in service since 1937, had evolved through constant refinement. The Bf 109 G6, the most common variant in 1944, could reach 386 miles per hour and climb to 38,000 feet. It carried a 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns. One 30mm shell could destroy a bomber. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A, introduced in 1941, shocked RAF pilots with its performance. Faster than the Spitfire V at low altitude, brutally armed, viciously maneuverable. These pilots knew their advantages. They fought over their own territory. Damaged aircraft could land at friendly bases. Parachuting pilots returned to service within days. They controlled when and where to engage. They attacked bombers with tactics perfected over years. Diving attacks from the sun, head-on passes with cannons blazing, vertical climbs exploiting the Bf 109's climb rate. When American escorts turned back at the limit of their range, the massacre began. Berlin remained untouched by daylight raids. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had promised this sanctuary. The capital's factories, rail yards, and government buildings operated in the sunshine. The psychological value was immense. If Berlin was safe, Germany could still win. The men who climbed into B-17 and B-24 bombers each morning understood the statistics. Before the P-51 arrived in numbers, completing a 25-mission tour was statistically improbable. The aircraft shook with engine vibration and freezing wind through bullet holes. The temperature at 25,000 feet dropped to 40 below zero. Oxygen masks froze to faces. Waist gunners stood in the open fuselage, wind tearing at their heated suits, watching German fighters approach. The psychological toll exceeded the physical. Crews watched neighboring B-17s explode, tumbling fragments and bodies falling 5 miles to earth. They counted parachutes, knowing each missing chute meant a friend dead. They saw aircraft with wounded aboard drop out of formation, limping home alone, prey for prowling Bf 109s. The terror of the unescorted zone, the deep penetration where no friendly fighter could follow, haunted their dreams. Some men broke before their first mission ended. Others flew until statistics claimed them. The replacement crews arrived young, trained in American skies where no one shot back. They lasted 3 missions on average. The veterans recognized the look in new arrivals' eyes, the certainty of death delayed, not avoided. The Packard V1650 Merlin engine represented American manufacturing genius applied to British design. Rolls-Royce engineers worked in tolerances measured by craftsmen's hands. Packard translated those tolerances into mass production specifications. The engine displaced 1,649 cubic inches, generated 1,490 horsepower at war emergency power. The two-stage, two-speed supercharger compressed intake air twice, maintaining sea level pressure at high altitude. This allowed the engine to burn fuel efficiently where other engines starved. The external drop tank innovation solved the range equation. Each P-51 could carry two 108-gallon paper drop tanks beneath the wings. Paper, impregnated with resin, cheap to manufacture, disposable. The pilot fed from these tanks first, conserving internal fuel. When enemy fighters appeared, a toggle switch released the tanks. They tumbled away and the Mustang became a pure fighter, light and lethal. The total fuel capacity reached 489 gallons with tanks attached. The Merlin consumed this fuel efficiently, sipping rather than gulping. Combat radius extended to 750 miles. No German fighter could match it. The 6M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower without the weight penalty of cannons. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. The synchronized guns fired through the propeller arc using interrupter gear. The .50 caliber round, originally designed for anti-tank use in World War I, punched through aircraft aluminum like paper. Incendiary rounds ignited fuel tanks. Armor-piercing rounds shredded engines. The Mustang carried 1,880 rounds total, enough for sustained combat. German fighters carried fewer rounds for their heavier cannons, forcing them to make every shot count. The Mustang pilot could afford to miss. Luftwaffe bomber interception doctrine evolved from years of combat experience. The defensive box formations American bombers flew, staggered rectangles of aircraft, overlapping fields of fire, required specific tactics. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high exploited the B-17's weakest defensive zone. The bombardier and navigator sat in the plexiglass nose, vulnerable. A stream of Bf-109s attacking in line could decapitate a formation's lead aircraft. With the lead bomber gone, the entire group's bombing accuracy collapsed. Vertical attacks from above, diving with speed advantage, allowed German pilots to fire and break away before defensive gunners could track them. The Bf-109G's 30 mm Malawian Quachas 108 cannon needed only 3 hits to destroy a heavy bomber. The FW-190 carried 4 20 mm cannons and 2 machine guns, a bomber killer's armament. Some FW-190s mounted underwing rocket mortars, standing off beyond machine gun range and lobbing 21 cm rockets into formations. The psychological effect was devastating even when rockets missed. The German pilots' confidence rested on geography and fuel. They knew the American escort's maximum range down to the minute. Fighter controllers tracked the raids on radar, positioning German fighters to attack after the escorts turned back. The slaughter zone began beyond P-47 range. There the Luftwaffe owned the sky. Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, Munich, the entire Eastern Reich, remained beyond American fighter reach. This sanctuary allowed aircraft factories to operate in dispersed, theoretically safer locations. It allowed training units to prepare replacement pilots without fear of being strafed. The strategic depth, purchased with bomber crew blood, seemed permanent. German war production planners, responding to increasing Allied bombing pressure in 1943, dispersed critical manufacturing to the Reich's interior. They assumed the eastern regions, Brandenburg, Saxony, Silesia, lay beyond effective daylight attack. Aircraft assembly plants relocated to these safe zones. Ball bearing production, devastated at Schweinfurt, moved to new facilities near Berlin and Leipzig. The dispersal required enormous effort, relocating machinery, retraining workers, establishing new supply chains. The benefit seemed obvious. British night bombers could not hit precision targets. American day bombers could not reach this far without prohibitive losses. The Luftwaffe's training infrastructure similarly migrated east. Advanced fighter schools operated in Czechoslovakia and eastern Germany, where student pilots could practice without fear of Allied fighters. These bases represented irreplaceable investments, fuel allocated despite desperate shortages, experienced instructors withdrawn from combat units, aircraft reserved for training when frontline squadrons flew undermanned. Losing these facilities would cripple pilot production. But the Luftwaffe High Command considered them untouchable. Göring's promises to Hitler reinforced this confidence. The Reichsmarschall, whose credibility had eroded since the Battle of Britain, staked his remaining prestige on protecting the capital. He assured Hitler that American fighters lacked the range to reach Berlin. He claimed the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots would annihilate any unescorted bomber formations. These assurances shaped strategic decisions. When intelligence reports mentioned a new long-range American fighter in late 1943, Göring dismissed them. The P-51 appeared in small numbers over France. It performed well, but surely the Americans could not field enough to matter. The miscalculation was about to cost Germany the war. General James "Jimmy" Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944. His first major decision revolutionized fighter employment. Previous doctrine required fighters to stay close to bomber formations, reacting to German attacks. This defensive posture conceded initiative to the Luftwaffe. Doolittle freed the fighters. He ordered them to pursue and destroy German aircraft wherever they found them. The new directive meant P-51 groups swept ahead of the bombers, hunting German fighters before they could assemble for attacks. Mustang pilots dove on Luftwaffe formations organizing below, scattering them, preventing coordinated bomber interceptions. When German fighters tried to attack bombers, P-51s dove from above with altitude and speed advantage. The Luftwaffe faced a choice: fight the escorts and ignore the bombers, or accept mauling from Mustangs while trying to attack B-17s. Doolittle authorized pilots to strafe German airfields on the return flight. Mustangs, after escorting bombers home, dropped to ground level and shot up aircraft, fuel trucks, hangars. This turned every mission into offensive action. The P-51's range meant pilots could hunt across Germany and still reach England. German pilots, landing with battle damage or low fuel, found American fighters waiting. The psychological impact was immense. The Luftwaffe lost the sanctuary of their own airfields. American fighter pilots training in 1943 and 1944 benefited from a system Germany could no longer match. They logged 400 hours before assignment to combat squadrons. They practiced gunnery until deflection shooting became instinct. They flew in fuel abundance, practicing aerobatics and formation flying until the aircraft became an extension of their will. The training took time, precious time Germany no longer had, but it produced pilots ready for combat. German pilot training, by contrast, collapsed under fuel shortages and combat attrition. New Luftwaffe pilots in 1944 often reached frontline units with barely 100 flight hours. They had never fired their guns at a moving target. They had never experienced the disorientation of a high G turn or the terror of a 600 mph dive. Their experienced squadron mates, the veterans who might have taught them, were dying faster than replacements arrived. The aces, the pilots with 50-100 victories, carried impossible burdens. Each mission might face 40 American fighters. Individual skill could not overcome such numbers. The psychological advantage of offensive operations cannot be overstated. American pilots flew missions deep into Germany, attacked targets, and returned to hot food and warm beds in England. They chose when to engage. They could break off if outnumbered. German pilots defended their homeland with desperation. Every battle occurred over German territory. Parachuting from a damaged aircraft meant possibly surviving. Running out of fuel meant possibly gliding to a friendly field. But the knowledge that the enemy reached their capital, that nowhere remained safe, ate at morale. The hunters had become the hunted. March 4, 1944, marked the first warning. The 8th Air Force launched a maximum effort against Berlin. 660 bombers escorted by fighters including P-51 Mustangs. Weather scattered the formations. Only 30 bombers hit Berlin through thick clouds. But the escorts made the full distance. Luftwaffe controllers monitoring the raid could not believe the reports. Single-engine fighters over Brandenburg. It had to be a mistake. Perhaps twin-engine P-38s misidentified in combat confusion. German pilots who engaged the Mustangs returned with disturbing reports. The American fighters were fast, maneuverable, and they had fuel to spare. They fought aggressively, pursuing German aircraft instead of hovering defensively near bombers. The mission briefing on March 5, 1944 at P-51 bases across England revealed the magnitude of the coming operation. Intelligence officers unrolled maps showing the route, red tape stretching from England across the North Sea, over occupied Holland, deep into the heart of Germany to Berlin and back. Over 1,100 miles round trip. The bomber force would be the largest yet assembled, over 800 B-17s and B-24s. The fighter escort would include more than 900 fighters, the majority P-51 Mustangs. The mission: destroy industrial targets in Berlin and break the Luftwaffe. Pilots checked their aircraft in pre-dawn darkness. Ground crews loaded ammunition belts, installed drop tanks, topped off internal fuel. Each P-51 carried those two 108-gallon external tanks under the wings. The weight made takeoff sluggish. The Mustangs needed more runway, lifted off slower. But once airborne, they had the fuel to reach Berlin, fight, and return. The pilots understood the significance. They were about to appear over a target the Germans considered invulnerable. The psychological impact might matter more than bombs. The formation assembled over England in the grey dawn of March 6, 1944. Box after box of heavy bombers, each box stacked in defensive formation. The fighter escort divided into roles, some staying close to the bombers, others ranging ahead to sweep German fighters from the path. The P-51 groups climbed to altitude, burning fuel from the external tanks first. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 50 below. Pilots checked oxygen flow, gun switches, gun sight illumination. The Armada crossed the North Sea. Below, the grey water stretched empty. Then the Dutch coast appeared, then the Zuiderzee. Flak batteries opened fire, black puffs of exploding 88mm shells. The formations flew through it, aircraft shuddering when shells burst close. A B-17 fell out of formation, 2 engines trailing smoke. Parachutes blossomed. The formation continued. The first German fighters appeared near the border. Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbing to intercept. The lead P-51 groups dove on them. The Mustangs had altitude and speed. The FW-190s broke, scattering. Dogfights erupted across the sky. The Mustangs' range allowed aggressive pursuit. German pilots, accustomed to American fighters breaking off to preserve fuel, found the P-51 staying with them through turn after turn. Some FW-190s dove for the deck. Mustangs followed, guns hammering. Aircraft spun into farms and forests. More German fighters appeared as the formation penetrated deeper. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, vectored by ground controllers, climbed to attack altitude. They saw the bombers, the usual targets. But they also saw American single-engine fighters still flying escort. Impossible. They were 300 miles inside Germany. American fighters should have turned back 100 miles ago. The Bf-109 pilots hesitated, confused. That hesitation cost lives. P-51s dove from the sun, exactly as German pilots had done to bombers for years. The reversal was complete. As the bomber stream approached Berlin, Luftwaffe fighter control reached near panic. Reports flooded in, American single-engine fighters over Potsdam, over Spandau, over the Tiergarten. The controllers demanded confirmation. The pilots confirmed. Silver fighters with invasion stripes, bubble canopies, unmistakable American markings, circling above the Brandenburg Gate. The bomber formation struck their targets through intense flak. Ball-bearing plants, rail yards, industrial facilities erupted in explosions. But the appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin mattered more than any bomb tonnage. The psychological fortress had fallen. German pilots engaged the Mustangs with desperation and growing dread. The P-51 performed better than intelligence had suggested. At altitude, where Bf-109s held historical advantage, the Merlin-powered Mustang matched or exceeded their performance. The P-51 could dive faster, sustaining structural integrity where German fighters' control surfaces stiffened dangerously. In turns, the Mustang's laminar flow wing generated lift efficiently, allowing tight sustained turns without bleeding speed. German pilots using traditional tactics, vertical climbs, diving attacks, found the Mustangs countering effectively. The combat stretched across the Berlin sky. Condensation trails marked dogfights at high altitude. Aircraft spun earthward trailing smoke and flame. The Mustang pilots, freed by Doolittle's directive to hunt rather than merely defend, engaged every German fighter they saw. The Luftwaffe could not organize coordinated bomber attacks. Every time Bf-109s assembled for a massed assault, P-51 scattered them. The bomber formations, taking flak damage but protected from fighter attack, completed their runs and turned for home. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, at his headquarters, reviewed gun camera footage from the mission later that day. The films showed American fighters over Berlin's landmarks. The footage was undeniable. Göring, who had promised Hitler that enemy aircraft would never reach the capital, faced the evidence of his failure. According to accounts, he reportedly said that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the jig was up. The war was lost. Not because of that single raid, but because the strategic equation had fundamentally changed. If American fighters could reach Berlin, they could reach anywhere in the Reich. No target remained safe. The dispersed factories, the training bases, the assembly plants, all were now vulnerable. The statistics from March 6, 1944, told the story in cold numbers. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. Severe losses but sustainable. The Luftwaffe lost over 80 fighters, destroyed with dozens more damaged. More critically, experienced pilots died. Germany could replace aircraft faster than pilots. The training infrastructure that might have prepared replacements now cowered under threat of American attack. The attrition spiral had begun. Major Gunther Rall, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, flew against American formations in this period. He recognized immediately what the P-51's arrival meant. The Luftwaffe had lost the initiative. They could no longer choose when and where to fight. Every mission became a defensive scramble against superior numbers with no sanctuary. Rall survived the war, but many of his comrades did not. The March missions over Berlin marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. American pilots returned to England exhilarated but exhausted. They had flown over 5 hours, much of it at high altitude in intense cold. They had fought a technologically competent, numerically inferior enemy and won. More importantly, they had proven the strategic concept. Long-range escort to any target in Germany was now possible. The bomber offensive could continue. The planners immediately began preparing larger raids, deeper penetrations, attacks on targets previously considered too risky. Berlin would burn in daylight. And the P-51 Mustang would ensure the bombers reached it. The Luftwaffe High Command convened emergency meetings in the days following the March 6 raid. The appearance of long-range American fighters over Berlin triggered strategic panic. Every assumption about defensive depth, safe production zones, and sustainable attrition had shattered. The dispersed aircraft factories in eastern Germany, relocated at enormous expense and effort, now lay within American fighter range. The training bases in Czechoslovakia and Poland faced the same threat. The Luftwaffe's carefully constructed strategy of trading space for time, using distance as defense, had become worthless. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. German synthetic fuel production depended on large chemical plants, precisely the industrial targets most vulnerable to precision daylight bombing. The Luftwaffe had always burned fuel at unsustainable rates, gambling on quick victory. By 1944, that gamble had failed. Pilot training programs cut back flight hours to conserve fuel. Operational squadrons received reduced allocations. Some units grounded aircraft not due to combat damage but simple lack of gasoline. When those units did fly, they could not maneuver aggressively without exhausting fuel reserves needed to return to base. The P-51s with massive fuel capacity could dogfight freely and still reach home. The technical advantage translated to tactical dominance. German pilot morale, already strained by years of combat, began to crack. The veterans who had flown since 1939 or 1940 understood the mathematics. They faced 40 or 50 American fighters on every mission. Individual skill could not overcome those odds indefinitely. The replacement pilots, thrown into combat with minimal training, died in their first or second missions. The survivors watched their squadrons bleed out, one mission at a time. The knowledge that the enemy now controlled German skies, that American fighters circled above the very airfields where Luftwaffe pilots landed, destroyed any remaining confidence. Major Gunther Rall, who survived the war to share his perspective, described the P-51's arrival as the moment he knew Germany would lose. Not because the Mustang was invincible, it wasn't. German pilots shot down P-51s throughout 1944 and 1945. But the combination of performance, range, numbers, and aggressive employment made defense impossible. The Luftwaffe could win individual engagements and still lose the campaign. Every downed Mustang was replaced by 2 more. Every lost American pilot was replaced by another fresh from training. Every dead German ace was irreplaceable. The strategic impact extended beyond air combat. With Berlin vulnerable to daylight raids, German leadership faced psychological collapse. The city's population, assured by Göring that they were safe, now huddled in shelters as American bombers droned overhead. The bombers often struck military and industrial targets rather than residential areas, but the terror remained. The Reich's capital, symbol of Nazi power, burned under American bombs. Newsreels could not hide the smoke columns. Civilians understood what military leaders could not admit: the war was lost. The week of February 20 to 25, 1944, became known as Big Week, a coordinated campaign to destroy German aircraft production. The 8th Air Force launched over 3,000 bomber sorties, escorted by P-51s and other fighters. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the factories, exactly as American planners hoped. The ensuing air battles cost Germany over 350 fighters and, more critically, nearly 100 pilots killed. The Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters. Severe losses, but the exchange rate favored the 8th Air Force. American production replaced losses within weeks. German production, damaged by the very raids it tried to prevent, struggled to keep pace. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the war in the West. The Allied invasion of Normandy proceeded under near-total air superiority. German fighters attempting to attack the invasion fleet faced overwhelming numbers of P-51s, P-47s and Spitfires. The few Luftwaffe aircraft that reached the beaches did negligible damage before being shot down or driven off. Allied aircraft flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300. The numerical disparity told the story. By late 1944, 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups flew P-51 Mustangs. The type had proven so superior for the escort mission that all other fighters were relegated to secondary roles. Only one group retained P-47 Thunderbolts, and that for ground attack rather than escort. The production numbers reflected the Mustang's dominance. North American built over 15,000 P-51s by war's end. The aircraft served in every theater: Europe, the Mediterranean, the Pacific. Everywhere it flew, it proved itself the finest all-around fighter of the war. The P-51's combat record in Europe stands as testament to its effectiveness. 8th and 9th Air Force Mustangs destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They destroyed an additional 4,131 on the ground during strafing attacks. The total of over 9,000 German aircraft destroyed by P-51s exceeded any other Allied fighter type. The loss rate remained sustainable. Pilot skill and aircraft performance gave American aviators an edge that numbers alone could not explain. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, flew P-51s exclusively from mid-1944 onward. These African-American pilots faced discrimination at home but earned respect in combat. They compiled 111 aerial victories and destroyed 150 aircraft on the ground. Their bomber escort record became legendary. They never lost a bomber they escorted to enemy fighters, according to their unit history. The claim remains disputed by historians examining detailed mission records, but the 332ND's effectiveness cannot be questioned. They flew the Mustang with the same skill and courage as any unit in the 8th Air Force. German pilots transferred from the Eastern Front to defend the Reich faced a shocking transition. In the East, they had fought Soviet aircraft that were often numerically superior but technologically inferior. They had adapted to that environment, learned its rhythms. Against American P-51s, everything changed. The Mustangs were faster, better armed, flown by well-trained pilots, and supported by endless logistics. Eastern Front veterans, accustomed to victory, found themselves struggling to survive. The survival rate for newly arrived pilots on the Western Front dropped to weeks. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not a single catastrophic battle but a steady bleeding of men and machines that never stopped. Historians debate how much the P-51 shortened the war. Some argue months, others suggest the margin was smaller. What is indisputable is the strategic impact. The Mustang allowed the combined bomber offensive to continue when it faced potential cancellation. It secured air superiority over Germany, making D-Day possible. It destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force, eliminating Germany's ability to contest Allied air power. In doing so, it saved thousands of Allied lives: bomber crews who completed their tours instead of dying over Germany, infantrymen who advanced under friendly skies instead of under air attack. The P-51 Mustang was not the only weapon that won the war, but it was among the most important.